Sex-linked inheritance. Here are your learning goals. Explain what sex-linked traits are. Construct a Punnett square to determine the genotype and phenotype of a mating involving sex-linked traits. Examine a pedigree and predict or explain the pattern of inheritance shown. Now we need to back up and think about chromosomes. We said that when we looked at karyotypes that there are 22 pairs of autosomal chromosomes and 1 pair of sex chromosomes. Sex chromosomes are pair 23, and there are 2 types of sex chromosomes, the X and the Y. If you're a male, you have 1 X and 1 Y. You got the X from your mother, and you got the Y chromosome from your father. If you're a female, you have 2 copies of the X chromosome, 1 from your mother and 1 from your father. The father determines the sex of the offspring. The father's sperm contains either an X or a Y chromosome. If you get the X, then you're a female. If you get the Y, you're a male. Your mother's egg contains only X chromosomes. And here's the X chromosome. And here's the Y chromosome. Notice how much bigger the X chromosome is than this little dinky Y chromosome. There are lots and lots of genes on the X chromosome that aren't present on the Y chromosome. And that's the basis for sex-linked inheritance. So what are some sex-linked traits? Well, the genes that control the trait are on the sex chromosome. Almost always the X, right? Males suffer from sex-linked problems much more frequently than females because males only have 1 X chromosome. And males get sex-linked traits not from their fathers, but from their mothers. The sex-linked trait is carried on the X chromosome. A male only gets an X chromosome from his mother. He gets a Y chromosome from his father. So if you inherit a sex-linked trait and you're a man, you've got it from your mother. So here are some examples. Hemophilia, which is the inability to clot your blood properly. Color blindness, baldness, certain types of baldness, not all types. And if you have excessively hairy ears when you get older, you can blame that on your mother. Alright, the genes that control the sex-linked trait are almost always on the X chromosome. There are a few that are located on the Y, but those aren't the ones we're going to be talking about. Okay? When we do a Punnett square, we're going to actually write an X and a Y to represent the X and Y chromosomes because the genes that we're interested in are being carried on the X chromosome. So we need to keep track of the X chromosomes, plus we need to know whether the offspring is a male or a female. So if it has 2 X's, it's a female. If it has an X and a Y, it's a male. If it has a Y, it must be a guy. Okay, so we are going to indicate the different alleles for the trait by using a superscript on the X chromosome, right? So when we're doing our Punnett square, we're going to write an X, and then we'll put a little superscript on the X to indicate which allele that particular X chromosome is carrying. Okay, like this. Here's 2 X's. We're going to put a superscript here. This is the dominant allele. This is the recessive allele. We know this X chromosome is carrying a recessive allele. This X chromosome is carrying a dominant allele. Right? Here's a man. A man only has 1 X chromosome. This X chromosome happens to be carrying the dominant allele for a trait. Here's a female. Here's her 2 X chromosomes. This X chromosome is carrying the recessive allele. This one's carrying the dominant allele. And here's a man. His X chromosome is carrying the recessive allele. So it's going to be a little bit different than what we did in our regular Punnett squares. Okay, so let's look at an example. we're going to take a man who has hemophilia and look at the offspring between he and his wife. His wife is a carrier for that trait. Now, here's their genotypes. The man has one copy of the X chromosome, and it happens to have the recessive allele for hemophilia. He doesn't have another X chromosome, so he's only got one allele, which he got from his mother. Here's the female. She has two X chromosomes. She's heterozygous. She has a dominant allele and a recessive allele. So she's not going to show the trait, but she's carrying the trait. She has a recessive allele that she could pass on to her offspring. So here's the possible sperm that the man could make. He could make a sperm with an X or a Y chromosome. And here are the possible eggs his wife could make. She could make an egg carrying an X with the dominant version of the gene. She could make an egg carrying an X with the recessive version of the gene. Here are their possible offspring, right? The genotypes. So let's look at the situation. This is going to be a female. She has two X's. She's heterozygous. She has a dominant and a recessive allele. So she's not going to have the trait, but she's going to carry it. So she's a carrier female. Here we have a male who's normal. He has one X chromosome, and he has a dominant version of the gene. So he's a normal male. Here's a female with hemophilia, which is a little unusual, right? She has two X chromosomes, one from her mom, one from her dad. Both of them carry the recessive allele, right? So she's a hemophiliac female or an affected female. And here's a male with hemophilia. He has one copy of the X that he got from his mother that carried the recessive allele and the Y chromosome from his father. So he is an affected male or a hemophiliac male. Then we're going to look at pedigrees. Pedigrees are family trees, and a pedigree is a tool that geneticists use to examine how traits are passed down. And this particular pedigree shows a man, George. Males are squares and females are round. So George married Arlene. They had 4 children. They had Tom, Sam, Wilma, and Ann. Ann married Michael, and they had Carla. Tom married Sandra, and they had Daniel, Alan, and Alan married Tina, and Tina and Alan had Christopher. So this indicates a marriage. This indicates children. Here's the symbols again. A normal male would be a clear square. An affected male would be a filled-in square. A normal female would be an open circle. An affected female would be a filled-in circle. A bar like this indicates a marriage. And if a female or male is half colored in, that means they're a carrier of the trait. We're going to see this mostly in the pedigrees we look at with females because we're interested in sex-linked traits. Okay, so a carrier is someone who's carrying a recessive gene, but they're heterozygous, so they're not showing the recessive trait. An affected person is someone who is showing the trait. Okay, so we've gone over this just a minute ago. These would be parents. This indicates a marriage. These are the offspring. All right, so let's look at an example of hemophilia. Let's look at an actual pedigree. Okay, here it is. Here's a woman and an affected male. They were married and they had all these children. This female married this male, and then they had these children. Okay, so here's what we can determine from this. First of all, the affected individuals are males, right? This individual is a male and is affected. These two are males and affected. We don't have any affected females. It's probably a sex-linked trait. Okay. The bigger the pedigree and the more individuals that we had, the more certain we could be about that. Another thing is that this is probably a recessive trait because it skips a generation. Notice how here we have an affected parent, but none of the offspring are affected. But the grandchildren are affected. So whatever problem this is, in this case it's hemophilia, it skipped a generation. It didn't affect the children, but it did the grandchildren. Only a recessive trait can do that. Right? Another way you can tell it's recessive is here we have two normal parents who have affected offspring. The only way that can happen is if the gene that's causing this problem is recessive. If it was dominant, then every individual that had that allele would have the problem. If these two individuals don't have the problem, but they have offspring that do have the problem, then they must have passed on recessive genes to cause the problem. And if we wanted to, we could go back and actually work out the genotypes of some of the individuals in this family. We know that the affected males have to have this genotype, right? And we know this genotype of this male has to be this. So this person has to be a carrier female. She has to be carrying this X with the recessive allele on it in order to pass it on to her sons. This could not have come from the father. Otherwise, he would have been an affected male. So we can color in her circle to indicate that she's a carrier.